Chad's growing anti-French sentiment. Protesters demand troop withdrawal amid shifting alliances in Africa. On Friday, hundreds of Chadians rallied in the streets of N'Djamena, calling for the removal of French troops from their country, with chants of Chad for us, France out, and banners proclaiming, "We don't want to see a single Frenchman in Chad." The protests reflected mounting frustrations with French influence in the region. The demonstration follows Chad's recent decision to terminate a long-standing defense agreement with France, signaling a significant shift in the country's foreign policy. This development is part of a larger wave of anti-French sentiment sweeping across Africa, as nations in the Sahel region increasingly reject Western interference and seek alternative partnerships. As the protests intensify, so do questions about the role of African sovereignty and the future of international alliances on the continent. Noble Black News: the African push for sovereignty. This story is not just about Chad, it's about the broader movement reshaping Africa's political and social identity. Across the continent, African nations are rising to reclaim control over their resources, partnerships, and governance. Movements like the one in Chad echo a growing demand for sovereignty and the rejection of exploitative ties to former colonial powers. For decades, France played a central role shaping the politics and economies of its former colonies, often maintaining a tight grip on their military strategies. But now, from Mali to Burkina Faso, and now Chad, Africans are saying enough. These protests reflect a larger narrative, the reclaiming of African agency. At Noble Black News, we believe stories like this are crucial. They highlight not only the struggles, but also the resilience and aspirations of African people. This is a moment for Africa to redefine its relationships, chart its own path, and tell its own stories. France on the defensive. Chad's announcement last week to end its defense cooperation agreement with France marks the latest blow to Paris's waning influence in Africa. Once a dominant power in the Sahel, France has been forced to withdraw its troops from Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso after public uprisings and deteriorating diplomatic relations. Chad was one of the last countries in the region where France maintained a significant military presence, with about 1,000 troops stationed in the country. The protesters in N'Djamena made their message clear. Hundreds gathered at a military airbase where French forces are stationed, demanding their immediate departure. Others rallied outside the French embassy, where Chadian security forces formed a protective cordon. Dr. Hissène Massa, a prominent voice in the protest and a former Minister of Public Health, summed up the sentiment: "We no longer want the French presence in Chad." This protest will end when the French leave Chad. The geopolitical shift. Chad's decision to terminate its agreement with France is not just a symbolic act. It reflects a seismic shift in the geopolitics of the Sahel. Countries like Mali and Burkina Faso have already expelled French troops and pivoted toward Russia, enlisting the Wagner Group for security operations. Chad now appears poised to join this trend, though no formal ties with Russia have been announced. For decades, France has justified its military presence in the Sahel as part of a broader fight against Islamic extremism. But many African nations are questioning the effectiveness of these efforts and accusing France of using security as a pretext for maintaining economic and political control. This rejection of France is also a rejection of the neo-colonial systems that have kept African nations dependent and underdeveloped. The protests in Chad are a declaration of independence not just from France, but from all systems that undermine African self-determination. Chad's complex political landscape. The protests also reflect internal tensions within Chad. Interim President Mohamed Déby Itno, who came to power in 2021 after the death of his father, Idriss Déby, has faced widespread criticism. While Idriss Déby ruled for over 30 years with support from France, his son has struggled to maintain legitimacy. Initially, Mohamed Déby promised an 18-month transition to civilian rule. However, in 2022, his government extended the transition period by 2 years, sparking nationwide protests. Many Chadians see the military-led government as a continuation of the old regime, prioritizing its hold on power over the people's demands for democracy. By joining the regional trend of rejecting French influence, Déby may be seeking to bolster his government's popularity. But whether this strategy will succeed remains uncertain. Noble Black News Perspective, a new era for Africa. At Noble Black News, we believe the events unfolding in Chad are part of a broader story, the resurgence of African sovereignty. Across the continent, people are rejecting outdated power structures and fighting for control over their futures. From grassroots protests to bold policy decisions, Africans are taking the lead in shaping their destinies. This is not just about removing French troops, it's about a deeper desire for justice, equality, and empowerment. For centuries, African voices have been sidelined. Today, those voices are rising louder than ever. And at Noble Black News, we are here to amplify them. What's next for Chad? The road ahead is uncertain. The withdrawal of French troops could create a security vacuum, especially in a region still battling extremist threats. But it also opens the door for Chad to redefine its partnerships and chart a new path forward. Key questions remain. Will Chad formalize ties with Russia or seek other alternatives? Can the government meet the demands of its people, both for democracy and sovereignty? How will this shift affect the broader fight against extremism in the Sahel? One thing is clear. Chad is at a turning point. The decisions made today will shape its future and resonate across the African continent. At Noble Black News, we'll continue to follow this story, bringing you the perspectives and insights that matter most. Together, let's celebrate Africa's journey toward true independence.